All right, guys, so a little bit of a late start. That's all right. Just came around and chatted to a few of you guys. A few of you also did get called just for some feedback as well. So, of course, that feedback will just keep coming as you guys are busy, but you can continue with any of your assignments. So, for today, I'm going to start off with that recap, of course. So, I was asked to recap a bit on the perspective part for the road and a recap on the repeating options that we covered yesterday before we start anything new. So those are the two things I'm going to recap. But from the rest of you guys, is there anything else that you'd like me to go over again? So yesterday we kind of took the time to finish the house with pattern creation. We then looked at select same. That was pretty basic as well. So besides the perspective on the road, and the repeater options that we covered yesterday, is there anything else that you'd like me to touch on? All right, so we're all good for now. Okay, so I'll start off with the repeater first, and then I will do the road, as the road had quite a number of steps to it. So as a recap for repeats, what was the purpose behind repeater options that we looked at yesterday? What did these allow us to do? Okay, so to take the selected graphic and repeat it and make copies of it in either a grid format, a circular way, or even a mirror for symmetrical designs. So all of these function more or less the same way. They just give you different options. So depending on the one you are working with, you must select your graphic. It is worth it to keep all of your elements as part of that graphic grouped first, rather than trying to shift select each of them and then using a repeat. So keep those elements grouped, and then that's object, repeat, and then you can have grid, radial, and mirror. Each of these repeats in their own special way. Grid is going to give you rows and columns of copies, in which you can adjust with your white bars for more rows or columns, whereas your circle icons on the top and on the left, that is for the spacing between those copies. All right, so that is the grid repeat option. Now, is this creating separate individual copies that I can then go and customize per copy? No. So your radial or any of your repeat options, that is creating, should I say, the illusion of copies. They can still be printed out. The only issue is, should you want to now go and customize each of these? I want to make the shark a different color. I want to make its float, oh, that's a whale actually. I want to make its floating tube a different color. I don't know why it needs a tube, but it does. So if I want to just have those custom designs, any of your repeating options immediately or by default do not allow you to customize each individual copy, because what it is going based off is the original piece. So if I double click into that, I'll be able to only access and work on the original piece. So any change that I make to this is going to update across all of its copies. That is how any of your repeat options work. So what if I want to have a customized color per sticker? I still want to keep the same amount of copies, but I want to customize it. How am I then going to apply the repeat and break these apart as their own separate pieces? Anyone remember? How do I apply this repeat and now separate every single copy into its own individual sticker that I can customize? We need to expand, correct. So expanding any shape, object expand, what expand does to simplify it is it applies the effect or the feature, and it breaks up whatever copies you are making into individual pieces. That is what it does. So when you expand something that has any repeater option, you always want to make sure object and fill is checked on, so that everything remains individual shapes with their own colors. I'm going to say okay. And anytime you expand something, you permanently apply the effect. You aren't going to be able to go back and use repeater settings. I can't go and adjust the space or the number of rows and columns because that was something I specifically only got when I had repeat grid on. So expanding applies the effect and it removes any settings and customization that you had with that effect. It does still keep everything grouped together, however. So when I do want to adjust these, how do I go into a group without ungrouping everything? We need to double click. So please do not make the mistake of ungrouping and then regrouping every single time. Just double click into the group to then access each individual piece. And I can select each of them, which is something I wasn't able to do when I had the radial or the grid repeat on. And now I can go and customize these into any type of color and theme and design that I want. So I used the radial or the grid as the means of getting the copies. That is as close to step and repeat as you're going to get. Grid repeats. So that is for the grid feature. I'm just going to wait for my zoom to come back. The others, very similar. If you're going with the radial option, you select your object, repeat, radial. You don't need to select the element that it needs to wrap around. You only select the piece that needs to duplicate, right? So I'm not selecting the spring love design. I'm only selecting the flower. When you use radial repeat, you're going to get a circle repeat of it, which you can then move around with your white dot in the center. That is going to space them out a bit more. And your outer white circle with your arrows on the end, that is for the amount of copies that you want within this. Okay, so remember, with any repeat, especially radial, you do not need to select the circle that it is going around. You only select the graphic itself. If you did select Spring Love with this, then that entire design will get repeated in the form of a circle. That's how that works. And again, if I need to adjust this, I need to expand it. So that is your introduction to repeats and how they work. That is your most basic form, where you have values, you have sliders that you can use to help adjust the amount of copies. The alternative or the advanced version of this is going to help you with scale repeats and other rotation repeats as well, where it requires just a little bit more work with regards to getting it to copy and duplicate for you. But you are going to need that for some of your logo exercises like the star. You can see your star was made using multiple copies. But grid, repeat, and radial repeats, those would be your main ones. Okay, any questions about these two or three? Just need to join back here. Yeah. Okay, so if you want to space out, so the question here is, with regards to radial repeat, if I want to space this out, now removing it, spacing out is done with the white circle. That's what you'd work with. Then you have the amount of copies, and what it'll do is it'll create spaces in between based off the amount of copies. It doesn't make them bigger or smaller to fill up that space. But if you need to customize, you might want to expand and manually adjust it. Same with removing copies. If you do need to remove copies with the radial repeat, there is almost this half circle effect at the bottom. Actually going to deselect here. Half circle effect that you can click on. And as you drag that either left to right, you can remove copies, but along the circle itself. But if there's specific areas that you need to get rid of and adjust, you might just expand it and do it manually from there. All right. And then the last thing was the road and the perspective. So let's go through this. Now with the road itself, we use the appearance palette for this. Okay, appearance played a big part in saving the amount of shapes that I needed to make that particular road. Now, is there anything in the appearance palette that you'd like me to go over again? Remember, appearance allows you to have double strokes and fills. That's all it does. So any shape that you create always starts off with a single line or a single stroke and a single fill. The appearance palette allows you to add more to give you a double border effect. You can use this on the line tool and you can use this on your basic shapes. You can even use it on text later on as well. But essentially, in the appearance, you can sort of activate or work with each fill as its own separate piece, rather than working with it as one piece in the control wheel. So in here, when you are selecting it, I'm just going to do this very quickly. I'm going to add in a new stroke. I'm going to make that white. And by default, anytime you add in another fill or stroke, it's always going to cover what was underneath. And it'll also copy the same settings. So I have two strokes on this line, a black and a white, but I can only see the white. And that is because it is the same thickness. So if something is the same size and they are layered on top of each other, you're not going to be able to see that. So I'm going to take the stroke above, which is the white, as that's what I can see. And I'm just going to decrease that as well. So now I'll start to see the black coming through behind that. The appearance palette also allows you to work with stroke settings per color. So either stroke for the white or stroke for the black. When I click on the word stroke, you're going to get access to elements like dashes, arrowheads, and even width options to adjust the transitions within the outline itself. I'm just going to tick on the dashed option. You have a lot of room for different types of dashes. Yesterday, we only focused on the first two, dash and gap. Any more, and it would kind of get a little bit busy and overcomplicated, so we're sticking with the first two. But essentially, dash is the length of it, so I'm just going to put in a random number, and the gap is the space between each dash that it creates. And that's pretty much all you need to know for that. So that is your appearance palette. You can stack fill options and stack stroke options as well. That brought us to the end of the road. The last thing we did here was the perspective side of things. Now, perspective, we looked at it in sort of terms with an effect, where with your entire line still selected, we went up to the effect menu, transform or distort and transform, free distort. And from there, this is where we could distort our road to put that into perspective. Now, because we started with the line tool, the shape I'm getting is just a line. You're not seeing your rectangles, you're not seeing your dashes. So if you were to try and achieve perspective through this by clicking on the black nodes and dragging that around to give you this sort of angle, I'm going to say, okay, this is all you're going to get. It's going to separate those pieces. So that is why, in order to use any type of effect, I would suggest expanding your shapes, especially if you worked with the appearance palette. So only once I've expanded something will my distort and transform actually give it to me in the form of a rectangle. Because right now, all this is it's just a line. There isn't any rectangles or any separate pieces for the dash itself. So anytime I need to apply any sort of distortion effect, I must expand the shape if I used appearance palette. If you build your road by scratch with rectangles, you don't need to expand. Expanding only serves the purpose of applying the appearance settings and separating them into separate shapes. That's all expand does. If I made my road using individual rectangles from the beginning, you wouldn't need to expand. you would skip that step entirely. So now I'm going to go to the object menu. And if you're using the appearance palette, you have two stages. Expand appearance, which is to now apply the stroke settings. I'm going to expand it. Okay, it still isn't separated into individual shapes. I'm going to go back to the object menu and I'm going to expand again so that I can now get separate fill and stroke shapes. After I've expanded, this is what this now looks like. Individual rectangles, and even the stroke has been converted into its own rectangle. Only after I've expanded can I then go and select that, go back and apply the same effect, except this time, instead of a line, I have the full road itself with all four corners that I can adjust. So when I click in any of these areas to adjust that perspective, pulling them more towards the middle, I'll say, okay. Now, instead of my dash jumping off the rectangle and going to a different part on the page, that stays together and they both move in the same direction. So the only reason we expanded was because we used appearance palette and the effect needed to work with individual shapes. So expanding it told Illustrator, instead of keeping this now as one shape, take my double stroke and convert those into two separate shapes for me, a black rectangle and a set of white rectangles. So the appearance palette no longer has any double stroke effect. If I was to go and adjust that, that is gone. Once you expand something, you are permanently applying a change because you are happy with it. You can't go back and rework the settings unless you start that entire process from the beginning again. So that is what expand does. It kind of locks in the appearance and the setting, and it stops you from going and adjusting anything thereafter. All right, any questions about that part? Okay, so expand for repeaters, object repeat. Okay, if you want to now work with any of those repeats on an individual basis, and expand only if you are working with the appearance palette and you want to apply some type of distortion effect. Those are the two areas where you would want to use expand, for repeaters and for distortion effects. All right. So if you guys are done there, I'd like you to just close whatever you have open if you're not working on it. And we're going to look now at the advanced version of your repeats. So we did radial, we did grid. What we're going to look at, just to sort of actually open this up, is something referred to as a power transform, which is going to allow you to accomplish similar elements like a grid and a radial repeat, but you're going to get a little bit more customization when it comes to scaling. If you want to scale, repeat something. If you want to rotate, repeat. So this is now your advanced version. So I'd like you guys to maybe create a new document, single A4. You can call that power transform. Or if you guys had an Illustrator file that you've been doing all of your logos in, you can go into that one and add to it. Because remember, these all form part of your logo exercise. So I'm just going to have that there. Logo exercise if you're starting a new file. Okay, now the two that we'll start with in sort of understanding how this works is going to be your little atom symbol at the top and your star. Now, for those of you who did the star, you asked me if there was a step and repeat. There's no step and repeat. If you managed to do the star, how did you do it? Painstakingly copied, pasted, and you made smaller. Did you have a different method? Okay. Okay, so you found a sort of workaround using keyboard shortcuts for that, all right? Sebastian, how did you do yours? You? Blend. Okay, so you used a different element entirely. Okay, so two very different ways of achieving the star tool. One was through keyboard shortcuts, and the other was through using something called a blend. Now, a blend we will come back to, but I'm going to show you guys the proper way in terms of achieving something like this using your repeat options, except it's not radial or grid. This is more on the advanced manual way of doing things, and that falls under a transform. Now, if you guys remember back in InDesign, let me just close this down. Back in InDesign, if I wanted to move something, but make copies of it so that it moved in a certain direction and also created a copy of itself, we used something called transform again. Okay, so we remember transform again, where we either selected the shape, double clicked on the selection tool to give you the same move options. So it's exactly the same as InDesign. So recap on that. Your transforms consist of move, scale, and rotate. You have a few others like shear and flip, but our main ones are going to be scale and rotate. Those are the ones we will look at mainly. But as a recap, I'm going to use the move option. So any shape that you have selected, if you were to double click on your selection tool, you're then going to get a set of options. Now you don't need to follow along with this. I'm doing this for demonstration purposes. And right now, my shape, where it was at the beginning, has now jumped based off the values within this box. So I'm just going to bring these both down to 0 to start off at the right side. Now my preview is on. Essentially what I can do here is if I wanted more copies going in a certain direction, either horizontally or vertically, I would type out the distance that it needs to have moved by. So let me see the size of this shape. Okay, to make this easy on myself, I'm just gonna make this 50 by 50. Okay, 50 by 50. All right, double click. So let's say I want to move this or have a copy that's directly next to it. So if I was to put a position or even a distance, because they are both working the same way, let's say I type in 50, that's 500, 50. I'm going to get the same shape that's moved 50 millimeters to the right. And that's kind of now really side by side with my square. The purpose of this is once I put in a value here, in order to use transform again, if I was to just say, okay, and I use transform again, that same shape is going to move another 50 millimeters each time I go to object, transform again. But what I wanted to do instead was leave the original shape, but actually create duplicates for every time I hit transform again. Transform again is repeating literally the last thing that you did. It's just repeating that step. So instead of saying, okay, we clicked on copy. When you click on copy, it leaves your original shape. It creates a duplicate of it at its new position. And now when I use transform again, I'm going to get another copy that's 50 millimeters to the right. Transform again, and each time it's going to move 50, 50. So that is where your advanced transforms come in, with using specific transform tools for moving, for scaling, and for rotating. So I'd like you guys to just give this a try as a form of practice. Now, object, transform, transform again. You have a shortcut, Command D, which InDesign does not have. So instead of going all the way to the transform menu, once you've hit copy, just hold Command down on your keyboard and tap D for however many copies you want. And we'll practice this with the Move tool, so your selection tool. So it's referring to the transform. So double click. And so same settings. You're going inside. It looks like a void. All right. So that is your scale option. So you create the shape depending on what you're working with. Create the shape. Double click on the scale tool. Put in your setting of how small you want that to get. Then you hit copy. And every time you use Command D, it's going to create the copies for you, like so. And depending on the style that you choose to add to these as well, sometimes, like I said, it can actually give you almost like an illusion effect. Like this looks like a hall, for example, in those illusion rooms. What's happened to my window? Okay. Now, once you guys are done with scale, any questions about scale? Now we are going to look at the custom ways of adjusting where the anchor sits itself. But right now we are keeping all of that to the center at the moment. If I was to read your power transform notes. Now free transform relies on you manually clicking and dragging to adjust the scale. What we did instead was a numerical, where we would make sure that there would be an equal amount of space in between. So the first step is always to select the object. The second step is to select the appropriate transform, whether it's the move tool or the scale tool. And then the third step, in this case, it says to hold down the Option key or the Alt key and click on the anchor instead. We substituted that for double clicking on the tool itself. But if you were to try that out with using Alt click instead, it would still work. So instead of double clicking on the tool itself, if you were to hold down the Alt key or the Option key and click on that target anchor, it would still open up your dialog box for you to add your elements in. All right, so both of those lead towards the same area. Okay, so that is your scale option. And then of course, enter the appropriate values and then copy and Command or Control D, depending on the computer you are using. All right, so that is your star logo. Let's have a look at this guy. So we've seen move, we've seen scale. Which transform do you think we're going to use to achieve this? Rotate, correct. So we're going to start with that shape. I'm going to create with my ellipse tool, not a perfect circle, just an oval. And you maybe, depending on what we learned yesterday, you could have tried to achieve this using the radial repeat. Okay, you maybe would have thought to go into repeat, radial, and have tried to achieve a similar effect. However, where it would catch you out is the radial isn't going to give you the exact effect that you're looking for. You're going to get more crisscrosses and things like this compared to something that's uniform and clean. So the radial repeat or the radial repeat was not going to work for this because you're going to get a lot of uneven spacing in between. So instead, we need to use the rotate power transform. So scale power transform, we looked at that. We looked at it for move. There's your rotate tool here. I'm going to double click on that with my oval selected. And the only thing you have here is the angle option. Please turn on preview and let's talk about this. This only has angle. How are you going to know the angle at which this should rotate? How are we now going to go and figure that out? Can't. Unless I go in with one of my, I think if you guys remember your math sets from high school with your rotation, compass, and everything within it. If I went and did that, that's going to take me a bit long. Now, this is how you use the rotate option. You determine how many copies you want by counting the number of sides. In this case, I have around 3, 6, 7, 8 sides. Even though there might only be 1, 2, 3, 4 shapes, I'm seeing 8 edges. So I count how many I want. Then I come into the angle option, and I'm not going to try and guess the amount of degrees this should rotate by. I'm going to ask Illustrator to do a little bit of math for me. I'm going to say 360, which is a full rotation, divided / by the number of edges I want, which is 8. Now, if I am doing something from my own mind and I'm not trying to copy a logo, then I would type in directly the value that I want. But because I'm trying to recreate something, I count the number of edges, not the amount of copies you want, but rather the amount of edges. So 360 for your full rotation. And when you enter that, it's going to divide that by 45. So it's saying that in order for me to get 8 edges to the shape, I need to have each of those rotate by 45 degrees. And I would not have got that on my own if I went and tried to measure that. So one more time, double click on your rotate tool. In the angle section, use 360 / 8. That's the number of sides, not the amount of copies. So I'm physically counting the number of sides I have to this. Then when I hit preview to see the direction or by how much that's going to rotate, that's going to give me 45 degrees. I'll then hit copy. And you know the drill, Command and tap D for however many copies you want to make. But each copy will rotate 45 degrees from the last position. Okay, but if you guys are done there, anything to repeat for you guys? All good so far? You can finish that up, head out to break, and when we come back, we'll then speak about that blue anchor in the middle and how to move that and work with it. Hey Jared, we are going to be starting now. Sorry for the late start. We were kind of a little bit busy with other feedback elements, but we're going to be resuming Illustrator. All right, guys, so we're going to pick up for now. Still got a couple other parts of that transforms to go through. But for now, everyone comfortable with what we've covered so far? All right, cool. So we've basically covered the bulk of transforms in terms of understanding which one you're going to need for achieving either a rotation, a repeat, or a scale. Now, to add on to that is using the anchor point that we initially saw in the center that I told you guys not to move. We're going to use that in a practical way. You're going to see how that's actually going to work. Now, with this, I think I'm going to, let's having a look at the examples here. Let's do this one. Okay. So looking at this, what shapes are here? Circles, correct. Now we've got circles. What transforms are being used here? Okay, radial. Okay, it could be a rotate as well. And we have another transform, ignoring all of the multiple copies and focusing on just the one in the middle. How are we going to get this double circle effect? Which transform? Which one did we use for our star? Scale. So where this is different is looking at the shape. I can't really break this up, but if you were to look at the circles themselves, you can see they're kind of going and scaling towards a specific point that's not in the middle. They're going towards the bottom middle instead. So we're not going to do rotate first. We're going to do scale first. And this is what we're going to, it's going to teach you how to work with that target and changing that. Essentially, that target was for what? Changing or setting the direction that something will move towards, rotate around, or scale towards instead. So if we now want to change that, you need to move it around consciously. So if I want this circle to scale towards this point of the shape itself, we need to move this teal icon or this sort of bright blue icon. Now, very simple, you click where you want that to move towards, but you must be on that specific transform tool. So I'm going into scale, and then I'm clicking on the area that I want to scale towards. Now, what's the next step after this? Once I've moved that point that it needs to scale towards, what's our next step? Okay, so the next step, based on what we've done before, would be to double click on the scale tool thereafter. But this is what happens. When you double click on this tool, it automatically brings it back to the center. So that means we need another way of keeping this target at its new position, but also opening up that same box to access the settings. And double clicking the tool is not going to be the one that's going to get us there. Instead, what you'll use as part of your notes, the Alt click on the anchor point or Option click. So we've moved it already. Now I'm going to hold down Option or Alt, and with the scale tool active, I'm going to then click on that particular anchor. That's going to keep it in that new position, but it's also going to open up your scale settings as well. So double clicking the tool will bring it back to the center. So you have to hold on Option to do this. Once you've done that, everything thereafter is the same. You type in how small you want that to be, you hit copy, and then you use your Command D to have that scale towards a certain direction. I'm just going to increase the stroke so that you can see that. And then we'll actually go and radial repeat those. All right, and that's about as far as transforms as we're going to go for today. So some of your logos are going to be needing to use scale or rotate. Some of them you can achieve using radial repeats instead. Now, for something like this, just to show you that it is still possible with the rotate tool as well. Now, radial repeat can only go in the circular fashion. Rotate tool, just like with scaling, you have the ability to change the point in which it rotates around. So for demonstration purposes, to show you that it works exactly the same way, if I wanted to rotate this to achieve this type of graphic, I can select this. Maybe I'm just going to actually have it start like this or the other way, depends. And when I choose the rotate tool, similar function, you also get your marker or your target, which you can then click on a different area to place it, and then hold down Option and click again to open up your rotate box. So just like scale, if you are using the rotate tool, you can also move and change that anchor point. And the only difference was the fact that you only have angle to work with. So if I have, let's see, how many copies is this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 copies or so. Even if I just go with a random value. Now, if you want your shapes to rotate in a certain direction, you are able to add in negative values as well. Negative will make it go the opposite direction. So I'm just going in with any random value that I see fit here. Negative 25, copy, and I can continue like that. All right, so rotate is also a substitute for radial repeat, but you can get most, if not all of your logos done using radial repeat. All right, so in your transcripts, you have this exact page given to you. You also do have notes on the repeater options and how to use scale and rotate as well specifically. So if you need a recap, you can refer to those. But for now, any questions about the transform options? So this is referred to as a power transform because you are working with values and numbers. You are not free-handing the scale, the copy, and the movement. You're working with actual values. All right, assuming there isn't any questions, this is going to be the end of the transform side of things. Let's have a look at a couple of your other logos, one of which I saw you guys already actually going and working with, which is your sphere, your planet. Now, anyone managed to do this? Done and completed? We just need to do the ring, which is, if you guys did attempt this, where I'd expect most of us to get stuck at, because the ring isn't actually a full circle. We're trying to make the planet look like it's sitting inside. So let's start off with the planet itself. Now, how are we getting this sort of 3D effect? gradient. Now, at this stage, we aren't working with 3D just yet. We are using gradients and colors to help achieve that. So I'm going to get a circle in. That's going to be my starting shape. And I'll go into my gradient panel and I'll add in a black and white. Is there a specific gradient type that we'll be using? Radial. Now, when we use radial, as you can see, because I'm working with black and white, the shine is in the middle. But with your logo, the shine is not in the middle. It's actually towards a corner. So we're going to be looking at your gradient tool. We've already learned how to use gradients. Okay, it's not going to get any more complicated than this. Grab your shape, go into your gradient panel, and then choose the colors that you need as well as the style. Your starting point is a radial gradient. On my end, I am just going to change the colors. So when it comes to your logos, you guys do have free range to change colors. As long as it still looks as close as possible, that's fine. But if you are changing your bicycle or your planet or your camera to green, that's okay. It doesn't have to be the exact same color. So in some cases, like the planet, you can change up your gradient colors. That's fine. So I'm giving you guys the leeway to do that. So in my end, I am just changing this up just because I want to give it a little bit more of a realistic finish. Okay. So a little bit darker on the edge. So depending on how you use your colors and your gradient colors, you can more or less get the 3D effect already. But right now, that is sitting in the middle. So you can start with the default and then come back and change your colors. But I'd like us to have a radial gradient within their circle. After you've got that in, we now need to actually move the colors. We need to move where the innermost point sits, because by default, everything is towards the middle. That's with the radial. So if you want to now adjust your gradient like your radial, have the brightest point towards a corner or a different side, you're going to use your gradient tool. This is specifically for moving gradients. You can also edit them as well through this. But I'm going to click on this tool, and on your circle, you should get a thick white line with however many colors you had in that shape. So I've got one for each color. It's going to start right in the middle. How this works is you can double click on each color to change it, but you can also, by clicking on the white line, drag the entire piece around. So I can change where that brightest point sits. It's still going in a radial design, but now I am moving that point so that it's a little bit more towards the top edge of my shape. So grabbing it on the white itself. Be careful of where you are grabbing as well, because you do also have these black points at the end. Now the white bar kind of moves the entire gradient together, but the black square at the end, if you click on that, what that does is it scales the gradient as well. So you can have one a little bit smaller, you can have it a little bit larger, and that just means my darkest color that was at the end is actually taking up a little bit less space than what it was. So the black square is for scaling. The white or the black dot in the front, what this does, and you don't have to do it on your end, but what that does, because people often make the mistake of selecting that black dot doesn't move the whole gradient, it kind of pushes it. So it looks as if someone stuck their finger in paint and just sort of swished that across. So it gives it almost like that pushed effect. And now it actually kind of does still look a bit 3D. But that is what your black dot does. So the black dot actually pushes the colors around, like so. Whereas if you want to keep them in their circular format, drag from the white line instead. Okay, and that's pretty much it. So any shape that has a gradient, you can activate your gradient tool to push and move the colors around within the shape itself. Otherwise, we would need to do that through the gradient panel, color by color, because what it's actually adjusting is the location value that you have in this. But I'm not going to do that. I prefer to just use the gradient tool itself. All right, and that's all you really need to get this 3D effect. So let's talk about the actual ring itself. Let's go back. Now the ring is an ellipse. We start off with an ellipse. It is not the line tool distorted or adjusted in any way to give it that bend. We start off with the ellipse shape. So I'm going to create another ellipse. I'm not going to have any full color in this, and I'm purely using this for the stroke itself. And maybe I'll rotate that also. You might want to thicken up the stroke just so that it's a bit easier to see when it comes to splitting that. I wouldn't suggest maybe working with a 1 point, even a 2 to 3. Okay. Now looking at the logo itself, how are we going to get it to look as if it's sitting inside of that ring? We need to cut it. Why someone said delete as well. Or perhaps you might try a arrange to behind, arrange in front. Now, the first thing we do need to do is we do need to, in some way, split this up and delete that particular part. So deleting is part of it. Now, from the tools that we looked at, we have only really worked with the knife tool as part of our splitting tools. So if I was to try the knife tool, you guys don't do this, I'm just going to do this on my end. If I was to try the knife tool, and what I'm doing is I'm only cutting through the parts that I want to get rid of, which is going to be this particular side of my ellipse, so that when I delete that, I don't see that point. I only see the one that's overlapping. Now, if I use the knife tool and I cut across the path, is that doing anything for me? That's splitting that up. It's not. What it's doing is it's creating a cut, but this is still not two separate shapes. The way the knife tool works is that it has to go directly through the shape itself. So I can't just go on one corner and cut through. It's not going to actually split that in half. I would need to go through the entire piece for it to then register as two separate pieces. So the knife tool works by going through the entire shape itself. It is not something that you will use to cut a path. So that is when we look at the rest of our splitting tools. Now, if we remember how, or if I demonstrate again how these worked, we had the knife tool that needed to cut through the entire shape. We have the scissors tool and we have the eraser tool. So knife tool cuts through the entire shape, makes it two separate pieces. The scissors tool is not a cut through the shape. If you try and click and drag with your scissors tool, it'll actually give you an error saying it needs a path that it has to cut. So the scissors tool specifically only works with the path of your shape. It is not a click and drag like the knife. So how the scissors tool functions is when I have a shape selected, I will click on the path that I want to make the cut, or on a part where I need to make the cut. So I'll click once and it's going to add a cut. I've only got one. I'll come to the opposite end, click again, I've got another cut. How I know this is now two separate pieces is you would have seen that immediately after I made my second cut, I actually had a bit of a difference in the gradient and the way that was applied. So this is with the first cut, everything still looks the same. If I cut the opposite end, we can actually see my gradient splits into two. And that's how I know those are two separate shapes. So the scissors tool needs a path to cut, whereas the eraser tool is basically if the scissors and knife tool had a baby, you'd have the eraser tool because it does a little bit of both. You click on it, it's something you can drag, but also split shapes in half. But with the eraser tool, you're actually moving a chunk of the entire shape. You're not keeping the middle part or any area that you are on. You are moving chunks of the shape. And you can create some pretty interesting designs with this because it's not only a tool for splitting in half as well. So those are your three different types: knife, scissors, and eraser. The tool we need specifically is going to be the scissors tool because we are working with the outline of our shape. So similar to the knife tool, I don't like to work exactly where shapes are overlapping. I prefer to cut a little bit before that. So I'll grab my scissors tool, I'll select my ellipse, and with the scissors, I will click on one point to make my first cut. I will then move my view to the opposite area and I'll click the second time to make my second cut. When you do that, you will see that your path kind of stops at some point, and that's how I know that that particular piece has been made a separate piece altogether. So I'm grabbing the scissors tool and I'm clicking on the part that I want to cut because I'm snipping it out of that line. Once you've cut that, because it's a separate piece, you can either delete that or you can arrange that to the back so that it still looks connected, but one part is in the front and the other part is at the back. So let's cut that piece and then arrange it to the back. All right, so that's all I needed to show you with regards to your planet. I'm sure you guys can figure out the little shadow element behind it. The last thing that we'll look at is not necessarily a logo element, but it's part of your vector city. So I know some of us maybe started this, but I'd like you guys to create, if you need to clear your page, you can, or perhaps make a new artboard. I'd like you guys to create just a set of whatever shape, basic shape you want to use. So nothing fancy to it, just a basic set of shapes. And there's no particular number, but I'd like for them to be next to each other like this. All right. So what we'll look at is in context of a bit more of the creative side of things, creative design. So if we remember having, for example, InDesign, okay. If you remember InDesign when we were working with the word life and we needed to have an image run across all the letters within the word life. This particular feature in Illustrator is going to show you how you can have multiple separate shapes act as a single unit or item so that you can have an image or a gradient run across each individual shape so that it gives you almost a unique way of displaying your pictures however way you want. So to give you another example, so you can do this with custom shapes, you can do it with basic shapes as well. Okay. With something like this, for example. Right, so making use of basic shapes and having a single image flow through multiple at the same time. Now, if we were to do this, just using what we already know, you would go and place the individual image in every single shape, and then you would spend the next 5 to 10 minutes aligning that and forming the face. Now, there's going to be a much easier way of doing that, which is why I asked you to create your 3 separate shapes next to each other. If you want multiple shapes that are separate, so they are not grouped together, they are individual pieces. If you want them to behave as one, but still keep the gap or the space in between, you have to convert them into something called a compound path. So a compound path is 2 or more, there's no limit, individual separate shapes behaving as one piece. So if I, as demonstration, I'm just going to apply the same gradient to all of these shapes. All right, so same orange gradient. You can see these are all individual shapes by the fact that there's an orange to yellow, orange to yellow, orange to yellow. That's how I know. But now, if I convert this into a compound path first, and then I apply my colors, You still select all of these pieces. So I'm selecting however many shapes I created. I'll go to the object menu, and past clipping mask is compound path. You go to compound path, make. So nothing visually interesting is going to happen, nothing wow or amazing. However, it's going to convert it into a compound path. So you select all of those individual shapes, object menu, compound path, make. Now if I go and apply that same orange to yellow gradient, instead of it being individual gradients per shapes, it's now one single gradient that's flowing across 3 spaces. So instead of a very distinct orange, yellow, it's going orange and then it's fading into yellow across all 3. So this is behaving as one unit. If I convert that into radial, for example, okay, I can see my radial across all 3. So compound path takes however many shapes you've got with whatever gaps you have in between. And by converting it into that compound path first, you can have a gradient, or you could even have an image run through all 6 or 5 of those shapes as one unit. So that's what a compound path does. Makes multiple shapes behave as one unique shape. Okay, and that is when, if you guys want to try this out, how do we put images into shapes in Illustrator? We need to, so we could try file place. If I use file place, let's choose one. Let's go with this. It's not going to work. So Illustrator specifically doesn't use file place. We use clipping mask. So anytime you want to put an image into a set of shapes, either something that's brought or made by a compound path, or even a single shape itself, you need to use a clipping mask. So after the compound path was made, so I've created that with these 3 shapes, I can now create the clipping mask. Your frame needs to be above the image or the graphic that you are intending to put this into. When I create the clipping mask, I then have the same image flowing through multiple frames. So it's not me going and clipping apart each individual rectangle and then moving that around and trying to make that align and look like the face itself. That's going to take way too long. Rather, compound path first, then clipping mask, so that the image flows correctly over multiple shapes. And if there's no space, or if there is a space, it leaves that space. Okay, so you guys can try that out. After you've made a compound path of something, now try and use it as a clipping mask to put an image or a graphic inside. Okay, so select all of those pieces. So this is the non-compound path, right? Okay, now let's go to object menu. Let's click here again. Yeah, object, compound path, and make. Okay, so now that's a compound path. Nothing visually interesting has happened, but if you go and reapply the same blue gradient, so you can go to gradient panel. Just click on it. You'll see the difference. Now it's going all the way across. asked, can we edit this once the picture's in? What if I want to move the shapes, make the lines in between smaller or thicker? Yes, you can. If you want to edit this after you've done compound path and a clipping mask, all you need to do is double click into it, and then you'll be able to access either the image itself to move that around. So you'll need to do 2 sets of double clicking. Double click the first time to access the image. If you want to adjust the compound path itself, then you're going to need to double click on the frame. When I double click on the frame, then I'll go past the image and I'll be able to sort of access the individual shapes that I made, like so. And I can then actually move those around if I want to adjust the gap. So one more time, if you are working with a clipping mask and a compound path together, you'll do 2 sets of double clicking. The first time you double click will only give you access to the image. The second time you double click, which is usually on the compound path itself, the frame will give you access to the shapes. So you'll need to do 2 sets of double clicking. So anytime you need to go inside of something to edit it, you must double click again until you access exactly what you need to work with. In terms of changing the shape and so on, you might as well just redo that type of process. Okay, so there isn't a lot of logos that require clipping path and compound path, but your little star makes use of both. The LG logo, how are we going to make that? Scissor and line tool, okay, we can do that. The bicycle, I'm not going to do this with you guys. So you guys will be making the bicycle. I see some of us managed to do this. The gear icon. Who managed to do this? Most of it. Where did you get stuck? The bolt in the center. Okay, so that bolt is just a circle with a line going through it. That's what it is. Okay, so because I can zoom in, this is what it looks like. Gives you the illusion of the fact that it's a bolt. Now, let's perhaps do this one together. Looking at it, what do I start with? Okay, some said star, some said circle. Now, with the star, how are we going to get these rounded edges? So you pathfinder the circle to the star. Okay, so correct process, but different starting point. So I'm going to do the circle starting point. The star, if it worked for you, you got the result, that's good. So let's do that particular point together. So I'm going to start off with my circle, my ellipse. And I can worry about the gradient and all of that other stuff later on. I'm just getting the main shape done first. Okay, so circle. And after the circle, what shape am I then going to use to cut out these indents around it? That's going to give me this type of cutout. We need to use Pathfinder. So the next step is Pathfinder. But remember how Pathfinder works. Polygon, okay. So something that gives me a kind of V shape. So you can use polygon. You can also use a triangle. So my starting point here would have been to maybe grab my polygon tool, as you said, and as I position that, I'm only thinking about the first position right now. I'm going to turn that into a triangle, and I'm just going to rotate that. It's not going to be a perfect triangle. I am going to distort it just a bit, but that's going to be my second point. So this is what I've got so far. So a circle with a triangle at the top. Anyone need a reminder on how to get triangles again? Okay, so polygon tool, because that's going to give you straight edges. Drag and create a polygon. After it's created, on the edge of your box, you're going to look for a white diamond. And when you drag that up, you're going to decrease the sides. That's how you get your triangle. Okay. Now, after you got your triangle, we need to now have copies of it going around the entire shape. So what am I going to do for that? How am I going to get multiple copies of this triangle around the entire shape? Transform, okay? A transform repeat. And I heard you guys mention the radial. Now you could use rotation transform, but remember radial is what I showed you guys if you need to get something in a circular repeat. So we'll use the transform, but we're going to find it in the repeat radial section. So when I transform that into the radial repeat, I'm going to now adjust that so that it fits around the circle itself. Depending on the size of your triangles and the way they look, it's not going to be exactly the same as the logo in the actual page, but that's fine. Okay, now after you've got these repeats, you now need to go and cut them out of the circle behind that. So what are we going to use for that? How am I going to cut out the triangles from the circle behind it? We need to use Pathfinder. So I can select both of these pieces, my circle and my triangle, and I can go to the window menu down in Pathfinder. Now in Pathfinder, I think I did bring this up either on the first or second lesson when we initially jumped to it. You have two sections here, shape mode and pathfinders. All of them are Pathfinder. I don't want us to confuse shape mode and Pathfinder as two separate pieces. All of them fall under Pathfinder. The reason why I'm saying that is because the ones that you are used to from InDesign are actually at the top. So you add, you subtract, you intersect, and so on. So from these Pathfinder options, the one we're going to use to subtract the triangles from behind is going to be the subtract option. Now, keeping in mind, both of these pieces need to be selected and they must be touching in some way, because in order for it to subtract the triangles, it needs to see over which parts of my circle it needs to cut out. So if your triangles and your circle are not touching, it is not going to work. Now, when I use the subtract option, does anything happen? Nothing is happening. Any idea why? We have to expand the radial repeat first, because the copies that it's made are not actual shapes that exist. And Pathfinder needs shapes to work. So if you skip the expand option and you go straight into Pathfinder, nothing is going to happen. So the first thing I'm going to do after I adjust my triangles is I'm going to object expand, leave the only two options available checked on, like so. And only after it's been expanded can I then select both of those pieces and then subtract. So if you're using your radial repeat, you must object expand first, your triangles. After you have expanded that, you can then select your triangles and your circle. And then in your Pathfinder palette, you'll use your subtract option, which is your second piece. Remember how it works is whatever's at the top gets kind of cookie cutted out from what's at the back. And then we'll look there. Now select that and your circle. So both. Oh. Yeah, and your triangles. Did you expand that? Yes, you did. So select. for you guys, I've been through some of these logos. You are going to get a third page or so that is going to see us into a bit of 3D and so on, but this will come to you a little bit later on. What you do have is your first two pages, and then you also have Vector City. Now, Vector City has compound parts being used, hence why I showed it to you guys, because that gradient that's flowing through the windows, that's one gradient across multiple shapes. I've shown you how to make patterns, so you guys can make patterns. This little flare here that you see, you're not making that. Okay, you're not making the solar flare icon. That is specifically, I'm just going to do a different page here. Let's get a background. Okay, that flare is with your shape tools, and it's called the flare tool. All you're really doing with this is you're activating the flare tool that's grouped with your shapes, and you are clicking and dragging on your page. You're going to get quite a complicated looking shape and how it's going to build itself, but this is essentially all it is. It creates a solar flare, and it looks different depending on the colors that you are putting it on. This is what it actually looks like. Okay. So depending on your background colors and the images or whatever shapes it's going over, this is kind of what it looks like. That looks cool. Okay, so that is your solar flare tool. So I'm going to leave you guys now for the last 4 or so minutes to finish up your logos that we've done so far, and maybe attempt the ones that I gave you guys to do this morning, because that does require repeats as well as transforms. And then you guys can make your way through the rest of that. So last 4 minutes, that is what I like you guys to be working on. So starting Vector City as well, since most of your logos are done. If you need any help with something, you just let me know. Is 12 o'clock, guys, so you are welcome to pack up and head out for the day. The room is free if you'd like to stay behind and work on anything. You don't need to move places. And I did chat to two of you just about staying behind for 5 or so minutes for your brand feedback. But I think I've chatted to everybody in class now, except for those two, so you guys can move forward. As the days have been going by, I'm sure Melissa has been messaging you guys on feedback with your InDesign and your layouts. So you will still be continuing to get some of that either from her or myself. So I will probably either speak to you in person in the mornings or just message you over WhatsApp. All right, cool. But have a good afternoon. See you guys tomorrow.